So I would like to start us by introducing and saying just a few words about our keynote, Pilar Jennings. Dr. Jennings is a lecturer at Columbia University and the Union Theological Seminary, focusing on the clinical applications of Buddhist meditation. She is also a faculty member of the Nalanda Institute of Buddhist Studies. Her publications have included East of Ego, The Intersection of Narcissism and Buddhist Meditation Practice, and I've Been Waiting for You, Reflections on Analytic Pain. Her most recent book, which we have over at our table, Mixing Minds, The Power of Relationship in Psychoanalysis and Buddhism, was released in December 2010 and is available for sale today. In addition, she is a practicing psychoanalyst in New York City, working both privately and with patients and their families through the Harlem Institute. Please welcome Pilar Jennings.
Good morning. It's good to be here with you. So you let me know if you can hear me all right? How does that sound? Okay. So I'd first like to say how delighted I am to have this opportunity to be with you all in conversation around clinical work that is spiritually informed or spiritually inclusive. And what I imagine is that throughout the day we will find that there is quite a broad spectrum of perspectives and insight into how to do good, sound clinical work that's inclusive of spiritual experience. And of course, that's as it should be, right? We have probably many backgrounds in terms of our clinical training. Right? We probably have equally as many backgrounds in terms of our spiritual experience and our faith traditions. And then we have yet more, right, ways of integrating our faith lives and our clinical work with lots of creativity, right, and lots of subjectivity. And so my hope is that as the day unfolds, we can be deeply curious about each other, what we haven't yet lived into, right? What we haven't yet learned about how to do good, substantive, meaningful clinical work that respects deeply our spiritual lives. So, to that end, I thought it might be helpful to start by briefly telling you a little bit about my own journey, how I came to bring clinical work and spirituality into conversation. And to begin with, just to give you a sense of my own background with spirituality, I was raised in what I would consider to be a basically secular household with spirituality that was hovering. And I think that had something to do with my mother, who was ethnically Jewish but raised in Peru, a basically Catholic country, and sent to Catholic school with German Catholic nuns whom she described as being alternately enlightened and sadistic. So you begin to see already, I was learning a lot about this conversion of psyche and spirit just based on her childhood and her experience. My father was raised as an Episcopalian, but then in his early adulthood began to self-identify as an atheist, someone who was disinterested in religion. And he didn't make that a firm, hard point, but I never saw him participating in any kind of organized religious practice or ritual. It was my mother who was very curious about all faith traditions, and she and I together went to a variety of churches. We went to Presbyterian Church, we went to Unitarian Church, we went to Shul together, we went to a variety of different synagogues. And then we began taking Buddhist meditation classes together when I was about 9. And I think because of my temperament and my psychology, I was basically an introverted kid, a sensitive kid, I would say highly sensitive. I really, really liked being in a room with people in silence. It felt great. I liked the relational experience, the feeling of intimacy, but I liked equally the feeling of spaciousness, right? That it was possible to be connected to myself and connected to others without too much getting in the way. And so from that point on, I started to feel quite anchored to Buddhist spiritual practice as a way of organizing my own psychological development and my spiritual development. My mother remained curious but continued floating about. And I would say she's still a floater, which I respect. But for me, Buddhism became my spiritual home. Now, as I aged and I went to graduate school and was studying medical anthropology, I started looking at illness narratives, how people talk about pain in dependence upon the belief system of the listener. And the original idea was that I would be a researcher, I would learn about pain, but from a safe distance. And that felt right for a while. It felt what was manageable for me. But the more I learned about pain and suffering, the more I felt pulled in, and the more I felt called to somehow address it as personally and intimately as possible. And it was at that time that I was bitten by the clinical bug and had to figure out how to navigate my own relationship to spirituality, which continued to be a central part of my life, and this growing wish to somehow address suffering clinically. Now, what was interesting for me is as I then embarked on psychoanalytic training, I was aware that for some time, many of the central Buddhist beliefs that I found to be so liberating, so healing, were also fodder for a great deal of tension. So, for instance, teachings on no self. And those of you who practice Buddhism are aware that the teaching of no self is quite foundational to that tradition. This idea that any notion of a fixed, inherent, abiding self is actually illusory, right? That we're highly dynamic, everything about us. Right, our psyche is dynamic, the body is dynamic, right? Life experience is dynamic. Everything changes, right? Everything is impermanent, including the self. But given my own psychology and my own background, there was a way in which that spiritual teaching informed my sense, and I would describe this sense as a kind of organizing principle, that I should remain fluid in order to accommodate perhaps the too fragile selfhood of others. And so I began to notice that there was an uncomfortable tension for me around my spiritual beliefs and my psychology, my psyche. And it was through my analytic training that I began to be able to think more about my spiritual practice. And not to dismiss it, right? Not to judge it, right? Not to get rid of it, but to begin to relate to it more reflectively. And having that reflective space, for me, allowed me to enter into my spirituality more deeply, more fully, more consciously. So, I'll fast forward to today. Here we are looking at the future of spiritually informed therapy. And what I appreciate about that endeavor is I think it forces us to look at our understanding of spiritually informed therapy now, right? What is it we do, right, that works, that helps, right? What is it we need to strengthen or deepen? And because I'm part of a few communities that are composed of mostly Buddhist clinicians, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, in part because what I've noticed, and you may have noticed this in your own community, we have quite a broad spectrum of concepts and understandings and methods for good clinical work. And often what I find with my colleagues is our sense of what's going to be most helpful is very different, which again is all right, right? We're here to learn from each other, and my colleagues and I think are helping one another expand and deepen, right, what can happen in the clinical space. So what I thought I would do, since we're really working with such a big frame here, right? Whenever you're talking about psyche and spirit, you've got a massive frame. I thought I would just take a few minutes to walk you through how I typically work, right? Because often when we start to talk about spirituality and psyche, there's some confusion, understandably, about what that looks like in the consulting room. Right? If you're a Buddhist, how do you bring your Buddhism into the clinical space, right? If you're Catholic, how does that manifest in good clinical work, etc.? And while I consider myself to be an eclectic clinician and influenced by people of many, many different orientations, I have realized that there is a way I typically work, and so I thought I would just share that with you. So again, while I've been influenced by self-psychologists and Jungians and contemporary Freudians and relational analysts, the orientation that feels most resonant to me is an intersubjective one. And so I tend, as a therapist, to look at what's happening for the patient around their own multiplicity, right? Their own many, many parts that compose their being, their psyche. I look equally at what's happening between us, what's getting cooked up, created between us, and I try, to the best of my ability, to be aware of what's happening for me and my many parts, and how they might be interacting with the many parts of the patient. Now, I do this because it feels resonant and it feels true, right? That we have many states of mind, right? We have many different aspects of our being, and often naturally we'll say, hey, there's a part of me that feels like saying A, B, and C, but there's another part of me that feels like doing X, Y, and Z. So I think it's very intuitive for most of us that we're not monolithic beings, right? Indeed, we seem to be multifaceted, which, as Philip Bromberg wisely said, is, as it should be, is very healthy, right? Very normative. But when these different aspects of our being get polarized, right, or certain parts really go underground, and we get too identified with other parts, that's when we start to feel a lot of dissonance. Now, I use this notion of multiplicity because I do have, and I will admit it, a clinical objective to try and help the people that I work with begin to orient toward the part that is available for healing. Right? That's a part that I have experienced as being compassionate, very curious, right? Non-judgmentally curious, and available for good, wise counsel. I would describe that part as Buddha nature, but some of you might configure it differently, which I welcome completely. Perhaps deepest essence, perhaps the part of us that knows God and is known by God, as Anulanov would say. I welcome you to think about that aspect of our being, however you can connect with it. What I have found is that indeed the mind and the psyche does seem to be multifaceted but also composed of many layers, right? And often it's the surface layers we're most conscious of, right? But if you keep dropping down, what I have felt within myself and experienced with my patients is this very, very deep layer of mind that is laden with wisdom, right? That has needed answers that most of us long for, right? And we usually turn to others, right? Just tell me. Tell me what I'm supposed to do, what I'm supposed to think about the situation, how I should feel about it, right? Should I feel good about myself or not? You tell me. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's a practice called Lojong, which means mind training, and it's basically composed of pithy sayings. And one of them, which speaks to this issue, is, of the two judges, rely on the principal one. Right? So often we're looking externally, right, for that wisdom. And that's understandable. We are profoundly relational beings, and so we do need reliable mirrors. Right? We do need people we can trust when we're feeling rudderless. But I do find within myself, and again in my patients, that we most need to tap into this deeper resource. Right? We most need to feel connected to this internal, intrapsychic rudder. So in my clinical work, I do make efforts to help my patients orient toward that part, right? Now, often this causes some dissonance, right? Because if people come into treatment feeling totally bereft of their faculties, right? Totally ill-equipped to discern what's real or true, and then they hear, oh, there's a part of you that has all the answers, sometimes it can cause total bemusement. And I'll read a little vignette to give you an example of how that can happen. But over time, I have found that people are very much able to connect with that part, right? They just need reassurance that connectivity is possible. Now, as I'm orienting toward this internal resource, I also like to affirm that indeed, because we're relational, we do need others, right? As a way of offsetting the shame of the dependency need that usually arises in any substantive clinical encounter, right? It is often humiliating for people to feel that need, right? For someone else to bear witness, to affirm for us what we sense is true, right? To validate our needs. And so I find it important to tack back and forth between affirming that indeed whenever there's uncertainty, whenever there's pain and suffering, we can go within and we can look for reliable others, right? It's both, not one or the other. Now, throughout this process, I also, to the best of my ability, and I know you all know this is not always easy, try to help people access their experience directly, right? So often we tend to feel identified with what's happening in the discursive mind, right? We do have this extraordinary capacity to think and to think a lot. And that thinking, it can help us a great deal, and it can help us help others. But sometimes the thinking makes it hard to know what we're actually feeling, right? So I make an effort, again, to try and tack back and forth between the reflective part of clinical work and the more contemplative part, right? The part that just holds space for what people are genuinely feeling, right? Deeper layers of affect, and especially deeper levels of affect that are held in the body, right? That I find often we do need a sense of space and time, right? Just to know, what am I actually feeling in this moment? And often we need the body in order to figure that out. And if there's too much talking going on, right, and sometimes I'm the one who's doing too much talking, probably often, it becomes harder to access that level of experience. So to that end, and this has taken me a while to figure out through the sage counsel of others and through my own experience, that a slower pace is usually very helpful, right? To really reassure people that we have the time that we need, right? We can really slow down together just to see what you're most needing, right? See what you're experiencing in this moment. And this is so important because perhaps you have clients and patients who spend a good deal of time worrying about running out of time with you, right? Checking their watch and looking at the clock. I mean, I've done this as a patient too. How much time do I have? I got a lot to cram in here, right? And so there's a lot of anxiety that comes up around running out of time. And of course, existentially, this makes sense, right? We all run out of time in this body, and I think we carry that anxiety with us throughout our lives. So how to really hold, and sometimes firmly but gently, that we can slow down, and through that slowing down, we might be better able to access what's there. Okay, so what I have found, and of course I do want to emphasize that I am sharing with you to the best of my ability what has worked for me, and I wish to affirm that it doesn't always work, right? And Lisa and I were having a lovely conversation last night about the times when, despite our best efforts, it feels like the treatment isn't helping. And I wanna just affirm that that's part of being a clinician, right? Is sometimes being able to help and sometimes not, right? And just again holding for ourselves with compassion the limits of what we can do. That said, generally speaking, I have found that this combination of helping people recognize their own multifaceted nature, right? To get a little disidentified with certain parts and more identified with the more sequestered parts. Helping them slow down to access what's happening somatically, right? In the spirit of understanding psychic experience better. Generally speaking, and often, has seemed to be helpful with the common presenting problems of anxiety, right, depression, addiction. I don't know about you, but certainly most of my patients come in suffering from quite a bit of anxiety, right, and intermittent, if not chronic, depression, and some feeling of not having choice around a substance, right, whether it's food or sex or drugs or work, right, sometimes even reading, right? There's that sense of not being able to really navigate what's most needed, but feeling pulled in. And I have found that this basic method of helping people slow down to discern, right, the fullness of their truth, of their beings, seems to be helpful. What I thought I would do now is just briefly perhaps name what I have been learning through my work with Melanie and with others. I do find that my patients are great teachers, right? And I do try to show up with that humility to learn from them more about the human condition, but also who they're needing me to be, right? What kind of therapist, what kind of clinician are they needing me to be in order to help them the most? What I have learned from Melanie and others is that more and more patients are pushing for meaning making. Now, of course, this has always been true and may not sound all that different from our existential forefathers and mothers, right? People come in aware of their presenting problems, right? A tough, nasty boss, right? A partner who doesn't understand them, right? A parent who never fully loved them, right? An addiction issue, riddling anxiety. But I do feel that undergirding all of these struggles is this profound need to feel connected to meaning, right? And often, as Carl Jung said, right, the answer is right in the symptom, right? So when people talk about their addictions, I do try to help frame that as a very beautiful, very human need for creativity, for freedom, for spontaneity that allows for meaning making. And if we don't have that support and we don't have those spaces that allow us to tap into the meaning, it can feel like the drink, the drug, the sex will unlock that energy and put us in touch with what we're most needing. I also think that patients, and we do have some research to back this up, so this is part my personal and clinical experience, but I'm learning about this from others, that patients are increasingly pushing for a more holistic model of psychodynamic work, right? They need to know that their therapeutic experience will be addressed to the psyche, but will include spirit and body, right? Perhaps you have found, and I have found this to be true, clients and patients coming in to describe prior therapies. Often my patients, and of course you have to hold this data lightly, right? Because sometimes what's happening in a prior therapy was exactly what needed to happen and just didn't get worked through because of lack of readiness or the conditions didn't allow for it. So as I do this work more and more, I'm less inclined to blame a prior therapist for what didn't happen. That said, often patients will describe prior treatments where the clinician was basically benign, right? They were kind, but too passive, right? They sat back and they just allowed the patient to talk or to have his or her own experience without enough holding, without enough guiding, right? Or they will describe therapists who were too self-disclosing and too involved. So that balance, I think many patients are longing for balance in the clinical space where they feel and they trust in the presence of the clinician, whomever the clinician authentically is, right? And they feel and trust in the space for the patient to enter into their own experience as fully as possible. So what I have learned from this, both in terms of what my patients have experienced before they begin their work with me, and my sense that there is a push for an increasingly holistic model, is that I have needed more tools in my toolkit, right? I began this process with analytic training, and so I really privileged bridging that gap between the conscious and the unconscious mind, helping people tap into all of these rich, turbulent, unconscious experiences and resources, primarily through reflection, right? Primarily through thinking about and talking through. What I have found over time is many more methods are needed. And I have found this in my analytic community as well, that more and more of my colleagues are doing training in somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR, etc. right? That we need multiple ways of showing up in an attuned, aligned way with what a particular patient is needing. And what I appreciate about that is the call for curiosity, right? Always about what works and what doesn't, right? So, I think I would also like to just perhaps touch briefly on the shadow side, right, of the work that we do, just to be mindful of some of the challenges, right, that we might encounter in this work. I think for those of us who self-define as either spiritually oriented people or people of faith, that we sometimes run the risk as clinicians of too carefully managing or navigating the clinical encounter. Right? And this is something that I've thought a lot about, in part because in my community, there are clinicians who are very familiar with some extremely powerful spiritual practices. And so I think for my colleagues, it is tempting to primarily emphasize those spiritual practices in the clinical space, right? Let's meditate together, right? Let's do some deity work. Let's see if we can put you in touch with God or Buddha or Allah, right? Let's do some breath work. And again, all of those things might be exactly what's needed. And so I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't bring in what helps, but perhaps simultaneously to be very aware that our psyche does push for healing, as Carl Jung said, and I believe he was right? That within our own mind and heart, we have what's needed to heal. And so I'd like to just emphasize that balance between allowing a patient or client to first see if they can connect with what they're needing before we make a strong suggestion about what they're needing, right? Not, again, to be too passive, because that can drive people crazy, right? You might have patients who say, tell me what you think already, tell me what to do already. I'm tired of you redirecting all the time. And usually I'll say, I will, I promise. I'm going to tell you what I'm genuinely thinking and feeling, right? I'm not going to disengage here. I just first want to hold the space for what you sense you're needing, what you sense you're feeling. Now, I would also add that for those of us who are very, very deeply connected to our own spirituality and our own religious lives, how to protect the importance of reflection, right? The importance of thinking through in the clinical space, right? I mean, this is one of the great gifts of psychodynamic work, that we need to have direct experience, we need to know what we're actually feeling, but we need equally to be able to think about what we're experiencing and feeling, right? Otherwise, all we have is the direct experience, which is where we come from developmentally, right? Before we were verbal, that's all we had was a given moment. No capacity yet to step back and think, okay, my mother's cranky today because she saw her brother, and her brother always pisses her off, and I'm not a terrible person, she's just cranky. We can't do that for a long time, right? And often patients will come into treatment stuck in direct experience with very little ability, and I don't say that judgmentally at all, but an undeveloped ability to step back and think about what they're going through. And so for those of us who are really grounded in contemplative life, I think it's very important also to appreciate our need to reflect, right? Our need to step back and think things through. So my wish is that we may all continue to grow with and learn from our patients what is most needed in order to reduce suffering, right, of body and mind. and to help the people that we're privileged to work with discover a sacred space within the clinical space that reinforces their trust in, right, their access to a much larger sacred space that I believe holds us all. So I'm aware that some of you might be having your own thoughts and reflection based on what you've heard me say this morning, and I've been reminded that we will have plenty of time for questions and for conversation, which I very much look forward to. How much more time do I have now? 15 minutes. Perfect, okay. So since we are all kin here, and we're all at least very curious about the spiritual realm and its relevance to clinical work, I thought if it's okay with you, I would take a few minutes to do some practice with you. And that way, we've got something to refer to as we're in conversation throughout the day. And what I thought I would do now is, it's a practice that my patients who are interested in Buddhism, I don't usually recommend practices unless they ask first. But for those who ask, and particularly for those patients who have a very, very hard time accessing any genuine compassion for their own suffering, people who are really riddled with self-loathing, right, did not get the mirroring and the attunement needed to cultivate any real positive self-regard, right? There is a practice called Tonglen. Some of you are probably very familiar with it, and others less so. And it's a traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice, and Tonglen simply means giving and taking. And I find it to be a very effective and powerful practice for most folks, but especially for patients who are struggling, right? And as Karen Horney sagely said, we're really not able to do good clinical work as the patient until we tap into that compassion for our own suffering. Otherwise, we're always colluding with the superego, with the critical part, right? With the part that's just primed and ready to pass judgment. So to that end, I wanted to invite you, if you're comfortable, and if you're not, I understand that completely. So just do whatever feels right for you in this practice. Perhaps even if you like, you could just put your notes on the floor just to clear your lap. And in the Buddhist tradition, and I think in many faith traditions, it can be helpful when we're getting ready to do just some contemplative practice to first start with the body. And I know that this is the weekend and it's the morning and you might be tired from a long, full week, a long, full life. So I invite you just to take a moment to find a posture that helps you feel most present, most relaxed, most awake. And sometimes that wakefulness is supported by a feeling of elongation in the spine. So just to imagine an increasing spaciousness from the base of the spine all the way up to the base of the skull. And you can, if you like, just very gently close your eyes. If that makes you feel too sleepy, you can open them gently. And just allow your hands to rest either on your thighs or cupped and a few inches below the navel. And then I invite you to take 2 or 3 very deep and warm healing breaths. Imagining that the breath can enter into every cell in the body, every corner of the mind, allowing for a deepening feeling of our most natural state of stillness, relaxation, awareness. And then to just allow your breath to be easy and natural, just as your breath needs to be. And if, as you're with the breath, you notice any concerns arising in the mind, any worries, you can very gently simply note what arises and just allow it to rest, knowing that our worries, our plans will be there waiting for us. But just to really deepen into a few moments of being with the breath, being with the body. And then I'm going to guide you in one way of practicing Tonglen by first bringing to mind a particular way that you have been suffering. And you can take a few moments really to evoke the specific nature of this suffering. Really let yourself see it and know it. It could be suffering of the body. It could be suffering of relationship or loss or turbulence of some kind. Whatever it is, I invite you simply to let your mind connect with and even rest in the suffering. And then to begin slowly at your own pace to visualize this suffering as a thick smoke that you can breathe in to your heart center, where there's a bright, warm, powerful flame that can absorb the smoke and dispel it completely. And then to do as many cycles of inhalation and exhalation, where you are inhaling your suffering as this thick, dark smoke that gets burned up at your heart's center by this beautiful healing flame. And then to begin to breathe out to yourself exactly what you feel you are needing in order to reduce this suffering. And I encourage you to be as specific as you can be with what you're needing, whether or not it feels realistic. To really imagine breathing out to yourself what you need to be completely relieved of this particular suffering. And continue that cycle of inhalation of suffering and exhalation of freedom from suffering. And then at your own pace, I invite you to think of perhaps 1 or 2 people that you know, people you care for, who have suffered in a similar way. And see if you can call them to mind. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. But people you know who have been touched by a similar kind of suffering, and to really visualize them sitting with you, perhaps on your right side. And then imagine that you are breathing in for all of you this suffering as a thick smoke that gets absorbed in your heart center, and breathing out for all of you exactly what's needed to reduce the suffering. Almost as if there were a space within your mind to hold this suffering, a space that allows you to feel that relief that is so needed. And then again, at your own pace, I invite you to think of perhaps the many people, or as many as you feel comfortable visualizing, whom you don't know well, but whom you imagine have also experienced a very similar type of suffering. And you could see them sitting behind you. And then continue breathing in for all of you the suffering, and breathing out for all of you this freedom from suffering. Imagining this tremendous spaciousness within your own mind that can allow for this collective experience of suffering. And that warmth, that loving, compassionate part of your mind that is so ready with what will eliminate the suffering. And then if it feels manageable and comfortable, perhaps even to visualize a few feet away at your left-hand side, one or two people with whom you've experienced some conflict, some difficult feeling or experience, who have also been touched by this form of suffering. Really visualize them there at a safe distance, imagining that you are breathing in for all of you, your loved ones, the people you don't know well, the people with whom you've experienced some conflict, this collective experience of suffering. And breathing out to all of you, whatever is needed to be truly, genuinely restored to a feeling of safety and wellness, even contentment. And then at your own pace, you can release the visualization altogether and just allow yourself to be in awareness. No worries, nothing to be fixed. Just the pure awareness of this moment with the breath. An awareness that we can tap into for the benefit of all, so that all beings may feel cared for, all beings may be free from suffering, all beings may be peaceful and content. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. Thank you very much.